All right, so today we're going to continue our discussion of Paul's missionary journeys. We're especially going to look at his first missionary journey today. The last time we began this, I had mentioned William Ramsey, who I think is an important source for you to at least know about, especially if you're working on sites connected with Paul in what today would be Turkey. He'd be a good place to take a look, get started. I mean, yes, pretty old now, but I think still useful. A lot of people who work there, you know, obviously new things have been found in the last 100 years, but he does a lot of the groundwork for people, literally. I mean, he went there and went to all the sites, wrote down what he saw, so it's a good way to get an idea of what things looked like, say, in the 1890s, 1900. And he does a lot of work with the literature, sources or primary sources and things like that. So anyway, and just I think a good person to know if you're interested in Paul and interested in connecting him, like his work on Paul the Traveler and Roman Citizen. I think it's good. You know, when I was taking Latin, now I guess several years ago, I was taking it in the classics department, and I remember asking the professor what would be some of the best sources on Roman citizenship. The answer was the Apostle Paul. We know more about Roman citizenship because of the Apostle Paul and the New Testament references to things, you know, and then that's later been confirmed and expanded upon. But Paul is a good model for what a Roman citizen who didn't live in Rome, you know, what that was like. Also, I also had confirmed, that, and I think it's true, that we know more about Palestine in the Roman period than any other province of Rome. Why? Because of Josephus and the New Testament. So we have all these sources that relate to Roman Judea, Roman Palestine, Roman Syria. We have lots of sources that way. So I think sometimes we, I don't know, you know, if you're dealing a lot with sort of New Testament things and biblical things and stuff like that, sometimes you think you're sort of missing, you know, the big sources somewhere else. But I guess the short answer is, in this case, we're not, because these are the best sources. Well, let's move on. I believe I mentioned last time Tarsus, and that this is the birthplace of Paul, so I'm not going to go back over that again. But it does uniquely place Paul geographically in a geographic position as well as a cultural one. He is Jewish, but he's a Roman citizen. He was born in Tarsus and spends a lot of his life there, but he is also trained and lives in Jerusalem. So you think of Paul as somebody with a foot in each world, and bridging the gap culturally, I guess in some regards geographically, and also, you know, I guess with the church. The church is then expanded by Paul into geographic areas it had never been before, and that's what the missionary journeys are all about. And I think we mentioned this one too. Strabo's geography talks about Tarsus being a center of learning, what we might call a university town, lots of philosophy there. Paul was undoubtedly schooled in some of this. We can tell from references in his letters. Now, did we get to this one? I think we did. But this is, when you go to Tarsus, as undoubtedly someday you will, because you want to seek it out. Well, there's not a lot for the tourist to see. I hate to say it, but it's true. This is one of the big things you can see right here. There's an arch which is in the middle of a roadway, street. A lot, because since it is a large city today, a lot of the stuff has not been preserved. But geographically, it's on a trade route, north-south through the Cilician Gates. Also to the coast, it's close to the coast, so there was a east-west, a lot of coastal road east-west, plus sea routes. So it is well positioned to get to, say, Antioch and beyond, or to go northward, say, into the central area. Paul is sent to Jerusalem at an early age, and here are the passages that, once again, I won't read them all to you, but if you are interested, the mention of Tarsus with Paul occurs here in 3 different passages. Well, you might say Acts 21 and 22 is maybe one passage. So in Acts 21, 22, and in Acts 9, where Paul is sometimes identified as Saul of Tarsus or Paul of Tarsus. And here Paul says he was born in Tarsus of Cilicia. And Cilicia is the region. Remember we mentioned the Cilician Gates. So Paul, trained then by Rabbi Gamaliel, who is one of the famous, I mean, he is one of the most famous of that period. And then after his conversion, as it's often called, where he's on the road to Damascus, I'm assuming you know Paul's life story, but I don't need to recount it to you. I do recommend the Bible to you. That was something maybe you want to read. But as you know, Saul was a persecutor of Christians. He was there when Stephen was stoned. He was persecuting Christians. He was on his way to Damascus to root out Christians that were there. And along the way, he literally saw the light. Right? Used to be an old hymn that you probably don't know. I saw the light. I saw the light. Lord, I saw the light. Well, look it up. It's a pretty good song. Praise the Lord. I saw the light. And he did see the light. When he gets to Damascus, of course, he is told where to go to meet a guy there named Ananias. And Ananias is a little reluctant to meet with Saul because he obviously been killing a lot of Christians. Thought that maybe this was some kind of deception, but he did. And he was healed, that is, Saul was healed. And from there, he has to escape the authorities in Damascus. Well, here is a rough chronology of Paul. So I want to put this up here. I don't think I put this up here before. But, when you try to work on chronology of the New Testament or chronology of Paul, obviously you have to make some choices. I'm not going to go... What happened? There it is. I'm not going to go into all the choices that are here, but part of this has to do, of course, with the date of the ministry of Jesus, which has to do with the date of the birth of Jesus. So there's a lot of questions you can get involved with in chronology. Well, let's say Jesus' ministry is roughly from 30 to 33. Okay, 3-year ministry, starting around the year 30. Paul's conversion then would come around the year 34, after the resurrection of Christ, after the church had been formed at Pentecost and so forth. Then we know from Galatians 1 that Paul spends some years in Arabia. So that's unnumbered, right? Years, it's plural. So many people, and again, this is speculative, I suppose, but many people believe or speculate that Paul spent 3 years in Arabia, which would basically be the southern part of Jordan, like Nabatean country down there. Why 3 years? They said to sort of parallel the 3 years of Jesus' ministry, that he was trained, by Jesus, I guess, directly or somehow, out there in the desert. So Again, that number is not definitive. Then we know he goes to Tarsus, and he spends 7 or 8 years there, back in Tarsus, and then he goes to Antioch, okay? So when we meet him in the story again, this is after Damascus, after he's been healed, after he goes back, and people really don't accept him. They're afraid of him, that he's a spy or somehow planning something. Then we know he visits Jerusalem. This is probably around 46. He's gone on the missionary journeys. If you know anything about Paul's missionary journeys and Paul's letters, there had been a famine in Judea and Palestine, and he has asked the wealthy churches in Asia Minor and Macedonia and so forth. He takes up a collection. If you read his letters, you'll see the push for that. And so then he goes to Jerusalem. His first trip is right after his conversion. His second trip is probably some 9 years later, when he brings a gift to the church for those suffering from the famine. You can read about that in Acts 11. Then after that, he goes as a missionary on his first missionary trip, 47 to 49. Read about that in Acts 13 and 14. In 51, the so-called Jerusalem Conference, the meeting in Jerusalem, prompted because of the Christians in Antioch and the questions that have been arise there. That's probably around 51. So Paul goes there for that, to Jerusalem. And then 52, 53, second missionary journey, 54, 57, third missionary journey, 58, his arrest in Acts 21. Then he is arrested. He's being held for trial. It changes from Felix to Festus, or Festus to Felix in Acts 24. He wants to clear everything out. Paul appeals to the emperor, which is his right, and Festus says, all right, send him. Get him off of my plate, get him out of my jail, get him off of my docket. And so then Paul is released. What I don't have on here is Paul is shipwrecked. That would have been somewhere in 61 or 62. And then Paul is released after seeing Nero in Acts 28, around 63, still during the reign of Nero. And then Paul is executed along with about the same time as Peter in 67. This is after the great fire in Rome, where Paul was beheaded, according to Eusebius, and Peter is crucified upside down. All right, so this is a very quick overview. Again, some people might debate certain parts of this. If, for example, as, I kind of like to think he did, although I don't have any strong feelings. Many people believe that Paul actually visited Spain in an unrecorded, it's not in the book of Acts, a kind of missionary trip, because he keeps talking about how he wants to go to Spain. He certainly has time between 63 and 67 to make a trip to the west, to Spain, before his final arrest and execution. Well, there you have it, for what it's worth. And you can look for clues to try to put this together. Some people refrain from doing that because it gives you people a lot of ways to criticize you when you do things like that. Because you're putting numbers on the paper, you're putting them in order. Well, here's where Tarsus is. You see the Cilician Gates just to the north. Tarsus close to the coastal area on that angle on the southern coast of Turkey, along with some of the cities that Paul will visit. Notice you got Tarsus, you've got the Cilician Gates. There's Derbe. If you have studied the missionary journeys, you know about Derbe, Lystra, Iconium, Pisidian Antioch, Perga. These are all mentioned in the New Testament. By the way, if you get really bored sometime, you can go over to our library and you can find the, 8-volume set called the Anchor Bible Dictionary. Has sort of maroon covers, kind of reddish maroon covers. I recommend them to you for your paper, your research paper, if you're doing any site that has any mention in the Bible, both New Testament, Old Testament, or the Apocrypha. Every proper noun that's mentioned in those works has an entry in the Anchor Bible Dictionary. Well, I wrote small articles for that dictionary. I think 18 or 19 of them. I've lost count. I can't even give you the list of the ones that I wrote anymore. I can think of some of them, but a lot of them had to do with Paul's missionary journeys and a lot of the cities that he visited, some that were mentioned. I remember one of them was called Adramyttium, mentioned in the Bible. Adramyttium in the New Testament, the book of Acts. Paul gets on a boat, as part of his journey to go see Nero. He gets on more than one boat, if you study it carefully. One of them was a boat from Adramyttium. We have no evidence Paul visited Adramyttium. He might have, but he was on the boat from Adramyttium. So I had an entry on Adramyttium. Well, anyway, I have visited the site. It's right along the coast, north of Ephesus. Well, if you want to see some of the stuff from Tarsus, again, for the tourist, it's a little bit disappointing because a lot of this has not been extensively excavated because it's a modern city. But here are one of the streets that's there, 23 feet wide. You can see basalt stones that pave it. Guttering and curbing are in limestone. This is one of the main streets of the city. Okay. There are some excavations that are taking place there in a central area of the old city. And so a lot of it's along this road and the shops that are along the road. As I showed you, I guess, on a previous screen, here is one of the main features most people photograph now when they're talking about Tarsus. I suppose it is the most photogenic of the ancient ruins in Tarsus. This is the so-called Cleopatra's Gate. Cleopatra sailed to Tarsus after she had had an encounter with Mark Antony in Antioch. She sailed to Antioch to meet up with him and took him on her boat up the Orontes. She then sails to Tarsus. However, this is more sort of local tradition. This arch does not seem to have anything to do with Cleopatra. It's much later, but all the locals call it Cleopatra's Gate, okay? Because it actually seems to date to the early 2nd century A.D. Roman, and of course Cleopatra was probably about 140 years, 130 years before that, okay? But this is there, and it is in the center of town. Here's another depiction of some of the ruins that they're there that they are now working on. So this is one of the main roads that goes north out of the city and leads to the Cilician Gates. Paul undoubtedly traveled this road on his 2nd and 3rd missionary journeys. This archway, however, dates to the era of Septimus Severus, so this is after the time of Paul. So, when I take people, students, and others on tours, I try to give them a little different tour than what I call preacher tours. There are a lot of preacher tours to the Holy Land, where basically a preacher gets people from his church and they go together and they get on a bus and they get a local guide and they go around and see things. That can be nice for people, meaningful experience. But I try to give them a little more archaeology and history along the way. I remember we had a guide one year in Jerusalem who would tell us all kinds of stories about things. And of course, it had been a while. I hadn't really done a preacher tour. But when I did this tour, they stuck me with this guy in Jerusalem who was used to doing preacher tours. He had been a guide for a long time. And so he would say this stuff. I didn't want to interrupt him. But later on, I would tell the students, now, remember he told you about this. I said, it's really not probably true. And so then what happened was he would start to say something, and I noticed all the students would look at me. And then sometimes I would kind of go, no. And, and I would tell them later. For example, we went to the Garden of Gethsemane, which most tourists go to when they go to Jerusalem, right? So on the Mount of Olives, it's the place where Jesus prays, right? The final week. And so we go there, and there's a Church of All Nations, and next to it is a small gathering of olive trees. And that's called the garden, now called the Garden of Gethsemane. And some of them are very old olive trees. And so we went by one, and there was this big one there, and the guy pointed to it, and he said, now do you see this tree? Jesus prayed at this tree many times. And, The tree's only been there since 1943. No, that tree was an old tree. It was a very old tree. I don't know if it was that old. No, it had been there for a long time. It was and olive trees can live a very long time, 1,000 years or more. So, it's possible a tree might survive from that time period. However, to know that this was a tree, the tree, So what I was started to do, and I do this on all of my things, when people start to ask, well, did Paul walk down this road? Did Jesus do this here or there? I give them the 1 mile rule. That's what I call it. Within a mile of here, Jesus prayed at an olive tree. So you're a lot closer than you've ever been before. For most of the people that are with me, you're a lot closer to where Jesus prayed at an olive tree within a mile. So I usually do like the 1 mile rule. But a lot of people, they want to know the exact spot. And of course, that's not unusual. That's just a little too much certitude than what we have for most events. However, where the positioning of a road does not change. While this surface may date to a later time than Paul, the route of the road, and my guess would be if we dug down, we'd find an earlier ruins of a road that Paul did walk on. So, yes, Paul walked in this area. I'm pretty confident of that, okay, because he walked on these roads. And these roads that connect the Roman Empire, really for military strategy, primarily, and then they get to use for trade, but they're also used by Paul and other Christians to travel from town to town, so they're used by missionaries. This was not the reason they were built, but it is a function which they serve. Well, Paul also goes, his hometown is Tarsus. He goes to Damascus, as we know. He sees the light on the road to Damascus. Where is that? Well, again, we don't know exactly, but a lot of times people want to pinpoint a spot. He's leaving Jerusalem and he's going to Damascus. Which route did he take? There are likely routes, but we don't know the exact route. He probably went northward and then crossed from the area of the Sea of Galilee up to the other side there, and then crossed to Damascus that way. Well, what do we know about Damascus at this time? It's 130 miles north of Jerusalem. This is the other thing, that when you start to study Paul's missionary journeys, it'll give you a real appreciation of the stamina, the determination of Paul, because he walked everywhere. We have no record of him riding an ant, but even if he rode a donkey or something, these are long, hard journeys, 136 miles. How many miles do you think you could walk in a day and then do it day after day? Well, you're not going to walk 5 miles in an hour. That's pretty fast walking. You know, that's about as fast as anybody walks. Well, you're probably not going to sustain that. So let's say you're walking 3 to 4 miles an hour. Most people estimate that a day's journey by foot is about 20 miles. About 20 miles is what somebody could do in a day. And they would be moving along with that, you know, if you're carrying your stuff, doing your things. So if you do 20 miles in a day, to go 100 miles would take you 5 days. Okay? If you're really motivated, I suppose you could go further. But what that means is this was probably about a 6-day journey for Paul on the way to Damascus. And along the way, he is blinded by the light, right? So that's going to make his journey even more difficult. So it's going to take Paul between 5 to 7 days to make this journey. And when he gets to Damascus, he is then converted. I think he's converted in Damascus. I don't think he's converted at the light, but that's just me. He goes, talks to Ananias, and then Ananias is the one who actually tells him the gospel there, and then so forth. Anyway, so that is probably around AD 37, during the reign of Aretas IV, who is a Nabatean king. The Nabateans had some control, certainly of the trade and so forth, during this period. It's a Decapolis city, of which I've spent a lot of time studying the Decapolis, because I excavated at Abila of the Decapolis. These cities were a group of cities that were linked together during the time of Pompey the Great, who liberates them from Jewish control. At least that's the way the Romans will look at it. And some of the Gentiles that lived there kind of saw it that way too. Around 64 BC. So that's a definitive date. So this had been in the hands of Rome since 64 BC, and we're now at approximately 37, so about 100 years of Roman rule at this time. Now, once Paul is there, and you know, Damascus is also, it's one of, you know, they claim to be the oldest continuously occupied city in the world, which I think is probably a fair claim. It's a very ancient city. It's located along important east-west, north-south trade routes, past the mountains of the Lebanon and anti-Lebanon mountains. Has a good water supply. It has rivers that flow through it. And it had a very large road, street, in the Roman period called 50 feet wide. And this is called the Cardo. Now, streets, if you remember, you know, we've studied some Roman cities. If you remember some of the videos and things you've watched, the video assignments. The Romans would lay out a city plan. Now, of course, when they came to a city that was already old, they would sometimes remodel it, still try to do this, where they have a main north-south road that was called the Cardo, like cardiology, like the heart of the city, the main route, what we call the main drag, main street, I don't know, whatever it is. I guess here, I don't know what that would be in Lakeland. Maybe Florida Avenue. At least that's what I would think of. It may change names, but that road that goes from I-4 on down, that's sort of one of the main roads of the city, north-south. And then, of course, roads east-west. Now, this main road north-south was sometimes called the street called straight. That's because Romans liked straight roads. People in the ancient world tend to have wandering streets. When the Romans came in, I imagine there was a little urban renewal. And now, in the years past that now, buildings have encroached upon that Roman street. So if you go to the street called straight today in Damascus, which you're probably not going to do anytime in the near future, at least I wouldn't recommend it, you're going to find that it's no longer 50 feet wide because over the years after the Roman period, it was encroached upon. Now, if you remember, Paul is then later kind of gets into trouble Remember, what happens to Paul in Damascus? How does he exit the city? Anybody remember? Anybody a Paul aficionado? Yes?
Isn't he lowered down the wall?
He is lowered in a basket. Yes, precisely. To be able to leave, if you go in and out of the gates, if you're inside the gates of the city, the walls of the city, obviously a good way to catch somebody is to just wait at the gates. And most Roman cities had 4 main gates. Some of them had some other smaller gates. You could post people on those gates and nab him. So what they did, they tied a rope, evidently to a large heavy basket, and they lowered him down. This picture that you see here, see this piece of the wall? This is the part that they say Paul was lowered down, okay? And there's a little chapel in there. It's actually built into the old wall of the city, and they say this is where Paul was lowered down from the city, okay? If you go to the street called Straight, come right in the gate on the south, and then follow the first sort of road, street to the left, pathway to the right, I mean. You go back in there, and there is a chapel that's kind of underground. It's a chapel of Ananias to commemorate where Paul was converted. So in there, they have these lovely illustrations, which I'm going to share some of them with you. Here's one of them in various languages, Arabic and French. Here's Paul. They got Paul riding a horse much like a knight. I don't think that's what Paul was doing, but that's the way the artist conceived it. There's the light. Yeah. Well, the French controlled Damascus for a long time. And then here is the entranceway to the street called Straight. You can see a car, small car coming through there. It's still used. I mean, people still drive through it. When you go through the street called Straight, which used to be 50 feet, but it's been encroached upon, you can still see the pathway of the road. And then as you enter, if you immediately go to the right, you can go and visit the Church of St. Ananias. And here are the hours in case you're planning a trip. They may have changed, so you might want to double check. Once you enter that church, you will find these lovely photos or illustrations like this one. Here's Paul and Ananias. Paul being healed here by Ananias. Again with the French subtitles and Arabic subtitles. And here is the courthouse, the courtyard of the house of Ananias. And you see these people over here going through this doorway. That is the way you descend the stairs to get to the chapel, which they say was more on the street level of the Roman times, which is probably true. You turn the corner, and then you can see the people down in there. And then here is the chapel itself. So this is inside the chapel of Ananias in Damascus, off of the street called Straight. It's small, but it's dedicated to the conversion of Paul. And of course, I already showed you this chapel. Here you can see the Chi Rho, ancient Christian symbol there. This top part was obviously added on later. And then this was made into a small chapel. So here's Paul doing his extreme sports, descending in a basket. Okay. You didn't know Paul was into the extreme sports. He also did a lot of snowboarding, from what I understand. No, he didn't. Here is the first missionary journey. Paul has been in Antioch, but they go to Cyprus. From Cyprus, they go up to Antioch of Pisidia. They come down through the middle here. So this is roughly the route. The first missionary journey in Acts 13 and 14 geographically is the shortest amount. He had to do some of it by boat. A lot of the details are not given to us, and because he's on the island of Cyprus, had to get there somehow. I don't think he swam. So he took a boat, probably from Antioch harbor to Cyprus. He spent some time on Cyprus and then entered in. So here are some of the routes of the places that he goes: Pisidian Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, Derbe, and then of course there's Tarsus. So let's take a look. We just got a minute or two left. Well, let's take a look at the Pisidian Antioch. Again, today it's the ruins are on the outskirts of the city of Yalvak, which has over 40,000 people. Of course, that was a few years ago. Probably has grown since then, since I looked up the stats. It's on the slopes of mountains. You can see kind of in the background there. It is the boundary of the Anatolian Plateau. Turkey, the area of Turkey, or Anatolia, it's sometimes called, or Asia Minor, it's sometimes called in the New Testament, has a central plateau, almost sort of a little bit bowl-shaped, ringed by mountains that then slopes down to the sea. Okay, so that's important to remember some of the topography of Asia Minor. So the roads in this area go past the site, and then they head to Laodicea. Didn't someone do you did the site of Laodicea. It's 128 miles to Laodicea. So again, if you're doing 20 miles a day, 6 or 7 days, take you about a week to walk there. Paul and Barnabas visit the Pisidian Antioch, not to be confused with the Antioch of Syria, which is where they started, which was a much bigger city. And Paul here visit the city on their first journey. When they're on Cyprus, they have an encounter with a Roman official who says he's almost persuaded, right? But he had relatives in this city. His name was Sergius Paulus. So there's a lot of details you can find. So they traveled then by foot from Perga, of some 150 miles to the south, probably to the city on the advice of Sergius Paulus, who's mentioned in Acts 13. He was the proconsul of Cyprus and a recent convert to Christianity. He probably had relatives and land in this area, and that's probably why Paul went here and will preach. And we see then the style beginning that Paul will often repeat, almost a pattern to what Paul does. He goes to a city, a Roman city. Notice he doesn't spend much time in the countryside. He just travels through the countryside. He goes to the city. When he gets to the city, the first thing he does, he seeks out the Jews. So we often say Paul's the apostle to the Gentiles, but the first people he goes to are the Jews. He finds a synagogue. He finds if there's any synagogue. He finds if there's any Jews. He talks to them and he proclaims to them the Messiah because they already have a belief in the idea of the Messiah, right? And then he sees if he can get any converts there. He usually gets a couple, right? Not always. He sometimes gets them upset and they want to chase him out of town and things like that. So that sometimes happens. And then he tries to then reach out to others. And often what he's able to do then with that few Jews that are converted, and then maybe some Gentiles that are converted, becomes the basis of a small congregation that he kind of sets up, and then he moves on, moves to the next city, and then he will often write back to these cities. Sometimes he revisits them, and that sort of thing. Sometimes they write to him and say, Paul, we got a problem. Can you help us? That sort of thing. Okay? And then often he sets up leaders, elders, or overseers of the congregation, that kind of thing. So this is a pattern which Paul uses. All right, we better end there for now. We'll take this up again on